You're listening to delmarvastudios.net. Delmarva Studios is proud to present Conspiracy Theories Investigated, hosted by George Hobbs. Conspiracy Theories Investigated takes a hard look at some conspiracy theories you may, or may have not heard of. The very definition of a conspiracy theory is an explanation for an event or situation that invokes a conspiracy by sinister and powerful groups, often political in motivation, when other explanations are more probable. The term by definition has a negative connotation, implying that the appeal to a conspiracy is based on prejudice or insufficient evidence. We gather all of the facts, present them to you, and let you, the listener, decide if it is fact or fiction. Feel free to send us your thoughts, suggestions, and your own theories, to delmarvastudios@mail.com. You can also follow Delmarva Studios on Twitter, @DelmarvaStudios. And check out all of Delmarva Studios' great podcasts at delmarvastudios.net. Without any further ado, here's your host, George Hobbs.
What's up, gang? How are y'all doing? Hope you had a great weekend. Had a few emails this morning. Yesterday was, what would have been the 57th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. And people are like, dude, your conspiracy theories investigated. How could you not touch on the Kennedy assassination? And two reasons. One was because, listen, that is the most widely argued conspiracy theory in our nation's history. And everybody has an opinion on it. And during the Red Pill Radio last night, which is heard nightly at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, join us tonight. And I've given my opinion on that matter several times. I've told you on several episodes, including the Prescott-Bush episode. I think I even mentioned that it was obviously Bush, LBJ, and Allen Dulles. Now, obviously, they had a couple Secret Service in on it. It's no secret that before they made the turn into Daley Plaza, that Secret Service agent got off the back of the vehicle, which enabled a clear shot. Obviously, the fatal shot was from the grassy knoll area. It came from the side. So I didn't really just want to beat a dead horse. And I had plans for this podcast. And so maybe we'll touch on it again another time. I just didn't feel like going into it when yesterday, obviously, thousands of other people going into it. Anyway, today, November 23rd, it's episode 8, Conspiracy Theories Investigated. Today, we are talking about Nayirah al-Sabah, George H.W. Bush, and the Iraq scam. Before we get into that, just remember, every night at 9 p.m., Red Pill Radio, live on delmarvastudios.net. We also archive many of our podcasts there. Our podcast emanates from Spreaker.com, but most of our shows are distributed through all major podcast distributors, including Apple, Amazon, iHeart, and Spotify. You can email us, as many of you do, at delmarvastudios@mail.com. And we are on Twitter. Anytime we push out a show, we push it out via Twitter. And that is simply at Delmarva Studios. So, the Gulf War scam. Now, first I'd like to talk about how the Gulf War is projected, how it is taught in our schools. You know, I'll give you the basic storyline on it, right? We know that it was waged by coalition forces. There was 35 nations involved, and it was basically in response to Iraq's invasion and annexation of Kuwait, which arose from two big things, the oil pricing disputes and the fact that Kuwait was stealing Iraqi oil. And many people have proven that to be. We'll talk a little bit about that later. It was codenamed Operation Desert Shield on August 2nd, 1990, which is the day it basically all kicked off with Iraq invading Kuwait, and it lasted until 17 January 1991. And forgive me, there's a C5. I don't know if you can hear that, but there's a C5 taking off about a half a mile away from me right now, so it's pretty loud. And then when it entered the combat phase, at least for me, when I was in Khobar, Saudi Arabia at the time, I want to say the F-16 started taking off about 2,200 hours local time in Khobar, Saudi Arabia. And it lasted until February 28th. And we know most of it was just a pounding from the air. Most of the ground forces went through in absentia of much, threats from enemy forces. They had been beaten down. Their supply chain had been broken badly. Soldiers were giving up in hordes, which is one of the many reasons why we had to stop, proceeding with the actions. So on August 2nd, 1990, the Iraq Army invaded and occupied Kuwait. Now, it was met with international condemnation and brought immediate sanctions against Iraq by the UN Security Council. Now, right now, I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version of what's taught at school, okay? Immediate sanctions from UN Security Council, including good old Margaret Thatcher and legendary, just a great American, George H.W. Bush, Lord help us. And he immediately deployed forces into Saudi Arabia. He got permission, which a lot of people were surprised, but you'll find out soon that all this was prearranged. And George H.W. Bush quickly urged other countries to send their own forces to the scene and save Kuwait, even though we didn't give two shits about Kuwait. An array of nations joined the coalitions, forming the largest military alliance in almost 50 years since World War II. Most of the coalition's military forces were from the United States, along with Saudi Arabia, the UK, the United Kingdom, and Egypt, which I got to hang around with the Egyptians several times. In that order, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia paid around $32 billion. So basically, Kuwait paid us to, save them, and Saudi Arabia paid us for protection, because a lot of people thought that Iraq was going to keep rolling. But that was never, ever their thoughts. At no time was Saudi Arabia ever in jeopardy. That's why, how many times have I told you on this show? If you control the media, you control the world, right? Excuse me. The war marked the introduction of live news broadcasts from the front lines. CNN. That war made CNN. It made Wolf Blitzer a household name. It also earned the nickname the video game war, after the daily broadcast of images from cameras on board U.S. bombers during Operation Desert Storm. So the initial conflict to expel Iraqi troops from Kuwait began with an aerial and naval bombardment on January 17th, 1991, and it continued for 5 weeks. This was followed by a ground assault on 24 February. It only lasts 4 days. It was a decisive victory for coalition forces who liberated Kuwait and advanced into Iraqi territory. The coalition ceased its advance and declared a ceasefire 100 hours after the ground campaign started. Aerial and ground combat was confined to Iraq, Kuwait, and areas on Saudi Arabia's border. Now, Iraq did launch Scud missiles against Israel and coalition targets in Saudi Arabia. So, if you look at the Cold War, right, if you remember throughout the 80s, Iraq and Iran were, they fought for 8 years. Now, Iraq had been an ally of the Soviet Union, So there was a history of friction between Iraq and the United States. They were also concerned with Iraq's position on Israeli-Palestinian politics. However, listen, most of the Middle East is not like Israel, so let's not, nor should they have ever been singled out for that thought of view. They also disliked them for supporting many Arab and Palestinian militant groups such as Abu Nidal, which led to Iraq's inclusion on the developing U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism back in 1979. So, let's stick with this, not get too much into it. There was a lot of playing both sides of the fence. We know that George H.W. Bush loves the military-industrial complex. He knows the money that can be made from it. He also was an oil man, so he had much concern over the oil. He wanted war, and some people say, well, how can you say that? Well, let's shift gears for just a second. We knew that there was an incoming invasion, and we played both sides of the card. We almost were like a ninth grader in high school saying, hey, John, Mike said this about you, and then going to Mike and saying, hey, Mike, John said this about you, and playing both, trying to get them to fight, right? Luring them in. Let's focus on April Glaspie, an American diplomat and a senior member of the Foreign Service, best known for her role in the events leading up to the Gulf War. So she was appointed under Reagan, and she was there under Bush as well. Now, she was a Canadian. She was born in Vancouver, British Columbia, and she received her degree from Johns Hopkins University, so very smart woman. And she started working with the United States Foreign Service, where she became an expert in the Middle East. And after postings in Kuwait, Syria, and Egypt, Glaspie was appointed the ambassador to Iraq towards the end of Reagan's tenure in '88. She was actually the first woman to be appointed as an American ambassador to an Arab country. Because if y'all aren't aware, Arab countries did not, many of them still do not, look at women the same way they do men. Many countries don't allow them to work. They have to wear, when they go out in public, only their eyes can be seen. They're clothed from head to toe. You know the deal. So it was a big deal to be the first woman appointed American ambassador to an Arab country. And there's a very famous photo of April shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, and he was very cordial, smiling. And listen, I'm not trying to make Saddam out to be as a great guy. I'm not. I'm just letting you know that he was used as a pawn in George W. Bush's global game. So she had a reputation as a respected Arabist, and her instructions were to broaden cultural and commercial contacts with the Iraqi regime. Long story short, they wanted to westernize them, right? Subsequently, Glaspie was posted to the U.S. mission to the United Nations in New York City, and she was later posted to South Africa as Consul General in Cape Town, and she held that until she retired in 2002. So let's get to what actually went on, right? She had her first meeting with Saddam Hussein, and do you guys remember old Tariq Aziz, the deputy prime minister? It was Saddam's right-hand man, his little henchman, right? Now, in her telegram, July 25th, 1990, so about 7 days prior to Iraq invading Kuwait, to the Department of State, Glaspie summarized the meeting as follows. Saddam told the ambassador on July 25th that Mubarak has arranged for Kuwaiti and Iraqi delegations to meet in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And then on July 28th, 29th, or 30th, the Kuwaiti crown prince will come to Baghdad for serious negotiations. Nothing serious will happen before then, Saddam had promised Mubarak. And Saddam kept his words, right? Now, the State Department has not confirmed the accuracy of these transcripts, of course. But listen, Glaspie is not one to lie or make stories up. And this cable is actually online. If you go to the Margaret Thatcher Foundation online, the actual copy of the dispatch is there. Now, another version of the transcript, an expanded version, it says, "We can see that you've deployed massive numbers of troops to the south. Normally that would be none of our business. But when this happens in the context of your threats against Kuwait, then it would be reasonable for us to be concerned. For this reason, I have received instructions to ask you in the spirit of friendship, not confrontation, regarding your intentions. Why are your troops amassed so very close to Kuwait's border?" Okay? Now, this is the part where, and this isn't on Glaspie, this is on the instruction she's receiving from Bush. This is to Saddam Hussein regime. "We have no opinion on your Arab-to-Arab conflicts, such as your dispute with Kuwait. Secretary Baker has directed me to emphasize the instruction first given to Iraq in the 1960s that the Kuwait issue is not associated with America." Once again, Jane Baker, a crony of Bush, emphasized the instruction that Kuwait issue is not associated with America. You don't have to read between the lines to understand that as saying what goes on between you two is none of our business. So that is telling Saddam, hey, if you invade Kuwait, or we're washing our hands of it, that dispute is between you guys. We're not going to get involved in it. Okay? So when these transcripts were made public, Glaspie was accused of having basically giving approval for the Iraq invasion of Kuwait. It's very clear. And in September, even a pair of British journalists confronted Glaspie with a transcript of her meeting with Saddam, to which she replied, "Obviously, I don't think, and nobody else did, that the Iraqis were going to take all of Kuwait." Now, she was trying to say, well, we just thought they were just going to take their oil back. So, listen, when you're an ambassador to another country and you're asking if something's on the line, that is obviously playing both sides of the field for an agenda. And their agenda was to invade Iraq. Absolutely was. And it's really terrible to see because look how much money it cost. Look how many lives it affected in Iraq. Look how many lives it affected in our troops. You know, the 100 and some people who died, the 14th quartermaster who was killed with the Scud missile. Just one thing after another. And listen, before we get into the Nayirah al-Sabah video, because please understand one thing. You know, we talked about April Glaspie telling them, hey, we're not going to get involved. Then August 2nd gets here. Obviously, Saddam invades Kuwait. And everything happens. But people weren't on board just with that. Most people haven't even heard of Kuwait. Now, we didn't care. What's Kuwait? Another rich Middle Eastern country. Oil. Listen, we heard for 8 years about Iraq-Iran war, right? In the 60s, it was the 7-Day War. 70s, that was all the terror plots. 80s, there was, the barracks, the Marine barracks. Iran-Iraq war. We're like, oh my gosh, the Middle East again. Are you kidding me? So Bush had to win over the hearts and minds of people. That's what it's always about. They even teach us that in the military. You got to win the hearts and minds. But once again, it all comes back to money. And what is oil? Oil is money. And the U.S. concerns about safeguarding Western oil supplies were really what Desert Storm was about. Now, once again, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait was producing oil at record numbers, so the gas prices were, I want to say in the late 80s, I was paying like 75 cents a gallon for gas. Now, granted, the cost of living was much cheaper back then. But, you know, most people thought that Iraq was this huge military force. You know, obviously they basically fought Iran to a draw for 8 years. So think about that. People who are so scared of Iran, they fought Iraq to a draw, and look how quick we went through Iraq. Now, the only thing that we should be worried about, obviously, is do they have a nuclear missile? That's something that would be worrisome. But back to Saddam, not all the sins leading up to this were Saddam, okay? Many oil men in the West understood, once again, they kept the oil prices down by overproducing, which was Saddam's grievance. OPEC wasn't doing their job. Also, there is evidence, very clear evidence, that Kuwait was engaged in slant drilling of Iraqi oil. Now, what is slant drilling? So they would go up near the people in Kuwait, would go up near the border of Iraq, and instead of drilling straight down, staying in Kuwaiti land, they drilled down across at, whatever degree angle, and they were actually pulling oil out of Iraq, okay? So they were stealing money from Iraq. When you're a Middle Eastern country, listen, 95% of their income is from oil. It's not like the United States. Like if sales, we have a bad year in manufacturing, we still have all these other resources to pull from. England, the United States, Canada, we have several imports, exports, oil. Just so many resources to generate money for our country. So if we have a bad year in one area, we're still usually doing well in enough other areas to support our country. Not Iraq, not Saudi Arabia, not Kuwait. How many people go on vacation to Kuwait? So it's not like they have a huge tourist industry. Saudi Arabia actually does have a little bit of a tourist industry because that's where the Mecca is. So Ramadan, they get people from all over the world. But Iraq doesn't have that. I want to say in the 60s, they had a decent tourism, but listen, their money is in oil. So Kuwait was stealing money from Iraq under the border. And as one oil executive put it, slant drilling is enough to get you shot in Texas or Oklahoma. Think about that. Now, according to many people, and I can attest to this kind of. Now, where I was from, it was pretty clear. But the Kuwait-Iraqi border is not, back then, it wasn't properly demarcated. But listen, to play the I didn't know where the border card was is silly. They had GPSs back then. So I don't really accept that excuse. And a few days before the August 1990 Iraqi invasion, the Bush administration told Saddam they took no position on the boundaries, and they didn't contest it. And the U.S. waffling with Saddam goes way back further than that. Even after attacking his unpopular neighbor Iran in 1980, which was then considered a greater threat to Western interests in Iraq, Saddam really believed that he had support from the Reagan and Bush administrations. Until in the spring of 1990, he realized he didn't have support anymore because he openly threatened Israel with chemical weapons. So that he did get openly decried for. That was a poor decision on his part. Now, on the other hand, the U.S. did give Saddam critical military intelligence on Iran. They gave him loans, and they sold him dual-use equipment such as helicopters. Right? Remember what happened in 1979. Iran took American hostages. So while we knew both Iraq and Iran were bad actors, Reagan thought Iraq was the lesser of the two evils and hooked them up with helicopters and military equipment. Not so much missiles and tanks, but he could sell them helicopters and say, oh, it's just, avionic equipment. But they could reimagine them or configure them for military uses, right? And we continued to turn a blind eye when American private industries went in to help Iraq, such as France's rental to Iraq of super fighter bombers to attack Iranian oil bombers. So, normally we would condemn our neighbor doing something like that, but France rented them the super attendered fighter bombers so they could wipe out Iranians' oil targets, which in fact, hurt their money, their resources. And if you bankrupt somebody, you can't fight a war, right? Schwarzkopf, he was the supreme Allied commander in the Kuwait War. He confirmed that President Bush ordered him to end that war once Kuwait was freed, rather than follow through to Baghdad and destroy the regime. Many folks in this Middle East, Saudi and Kuwait, they see Saddam as the devil. The United States loves to hate. We've had successive U.S. administrations have preferred to keep in power, but keep them in a weakened condition, right? And every time we hit him with a cruise missile, his domestic image would grow because it would like, see, I can stand up to the United States. And he continued to grow stronger after the Gulf War because he still stayed in power. He's like, look, I fought against all these countries, including the U.S. and Britain, and I'm still standing, baby. So, and throughout the 90s, it was an off and on. We had Desert Fox, UN inspectors coming in, getting kicked out, one thing after another. But why did we play both sides of the card? Why did we tell them, hey, whatever you do is between you and Kuwait? If Kuwait's stealing from you, then maybe they do need to be spanked, right? Now, maybe they didn't expect Iraq to go to the lengths they did, but they certainly should have made that clear, because Saddam and anybody else reading that cable would think, well, it looks like the U.S. is cool with it. Let's go. So Bush was ready to go in. He had talked with many other countries trying to get them involved. And many countries were not completely on board. So Bush needed to find a reason to get people motivated so he could get other countries on board. He didn't want the U.S. to have to foot the whole bill. Right? He only really had Great Britain on board. So, the scam of the century. They brought this young lady. She was 15 years old at the time. Her name is Nayirah al-Sabah. And apparently, she was this young lady who was in Kuwait during the invasion, and she witnessed some terrible acts. And folks, after the world saw this video, everyone jumped on board to fight the evil terrorist Saddam Hussein. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Nayirah al-Sabah's testimony. Remember this. her testimony in front of the United States Congress.
Thank you very much. Our final witness is also using an assumed name, and again we ask our friends in the media to respect the need for her to protect her family. And we finally call on Nayirah to testify.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Nayirah, and I just came out of Kuwait. My mother and I were in Kuwait on August 2nd for a peaceful summer holiday. My older sister had a baby on July 29th, and we wanted to spend some time in Kuwait with her. I only pray that none of my 10th grade classmates had a summer vacation like I did. I may have wished sometime that I could be an adult, that I could grow up quickly. What I saw happen to the children of Kuwait and to my country has changed my life forever. It has changed the life of all Kuwaitis, young and old. We are children no more. My sister, with my 5-day-old nephew, traveled across the desert to safety. There was no milk available for the baby in Kuwait. They barely escaped when their car was stuck in the desert sand, and help came from Saudi Arabia. I stayed behind and wanted to do something for my country. The second week after an invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I could not help but think of my nephew, who, if born premature, might have died that day as well. After I left the hospital, some of my friends and I distributed flyers condemning the Iraqi invasion until we were warned we might be killed if the Iraqis saw us. The Iraqis have destroyed everything in Kuwait. They stripped the supermarkets of food, the pharmacies of medicine, the factories of medical supplies, ransacked our houses, and tortured neighbors and friends. I saw and talked to a friend of mine after his torture and released by the Iraqis. He is 22, but he looked as though he could have been an old man. The Iraqis dunked his head into a swimming pool until he almost drowned. They pulled out his fingernails and applied electric shock to sensitive private parts of his body. He was lucky to survive. If an Iraqi soldier was found dead in a neighborhood, they burned to the ground all the houses in the general vicinity and would not let firefighters come until only ash and rubble was left. The Iraqis were making fun of President Bush and verbally and physically abusing my family and me on our way out of Kuwait. We only did so because life in Kuwait became unbearable. They have forced us to hide, burn, or destroy everything identifying our country and our government. I want to emphasize that Kuwait is our mother and the Emir our father. We repeated this on the roofs of our houses in Kuwait until the Iraqis began shooting at us. And we shall repeat it again. I am glad I am 15, old enough to remember Kuwait before Saddam Hussein destroyed it, and young enough to rebuild it. Thank you.
Nayirah, thank you. And let me thank all of our witnesses. We've passed 8 years in the existence of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. We've had scores of hearings about human rights abuses throughout the world. And I know my co-chairman, Tom Lantos, will join me in telling you that we have never heard, in all this time, in all circumstances, a record of inhumanity and brutality and sadism as the ones that the witnesses have given us today.
That was Representative John Porter, Republican from Illinois. The only problem with her testimony? Well, it was made up. It never happened. As a matter of fact, she's the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, and she was coached. That's right, folks. None of that happened. As a matter of fact, she was living in the United States for all that time. She was not in Kuwait. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's true. Following this, al-Sabah's testimony has to become regarded as a classic example of a modern atrocity propaganda. As you just heard, if you didn't know what was going on and you just sat down and turned on the TV and you listened to that, not knowing any better, can you imagine how you would feel about it? Well, guess what? It worked. Earlier, I told you that Bush was having a hard time getting everybody on board with it, right? Well, that was widely publicized, and it worked to a T. Hill Knowlton, whom they had hired, this PR firm, they sent out a video news release to MediaLink, which back in 1990 served about 700 TV stations in the United States. And that night, back in October of 1990, back in 1990. October 10th, 1990. So we were still in Desert Shield, trying to get more people on board, trying to get the hearts and minds of America. An estimated 50 million Americans watched that night. 7 senators cited Nayirah's testimony in their speeches backing force, the use of force. President George Bush repeated the story at least 10 times in the following weeks, and her account of the atrocities helped to stir American opinion in favor of participating in the Gulf War. So the Bush administration got with U.S. ambassador, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, coached this firm, Hill Knowlton, coached up her testimony. They taught her how to be an actress. They sent her on Congress to testify with what you just heard. That fake testimony was a huge part of the reason we invaded Iraq. True story. It was ABC's Nightline, NBC's Nightly News. All of these people played it that night, and just everybody was like, let's go kick Saddam's ass. Iraq denied the allegations. On October 16th, Iraq Information Minister told the Iraqi news agency that Bush are using what they told you to make Congress ratify the budget, which is in the red because of your policies. Now, in a visit to Kuwait by journalists who were escorted by Iraqi Information Ministry officials and doctors at a Kuwaiti maternity facility, denied incubator allegations. In a visit to the Iraqi, the Iraqi head of the Kuwaiti Health Department, Abdul Rahman Mohammed, said that Baghdad had sent 1,000 doctors and other medical staff to help run Kuwait's 14 hospitals following the invasion. Because indeed, when Iraq invaded, there were some nurses and doctors who fled the country. Iraq did send doctors and nurses to try to help fill in. After the war, in March 91, John Martin, an ABC reporter, reported that patients, including preemie babies, did die when many of Kuwait's nurses and doctors stopped working or fled the country. And he also discovered that Iraqi troops did not steal hospital incubators, nor did they leave hundreds of Kuwaiti babies to die. So John stepped up and said that those claims were indeed a lie. On January 6, 1992, the New York Times published an op-ed piece by John MacArthur entitled, "Remember Nayirah, Witness for Kuwait?" MacArthur discovered that Nayirah was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S., Saud Al-Sabah. So understand, when she gave this, there was a 2-year span from the time she gave the speech until they found out about it. MacArthur noted that the incubator story seriously distorted the American debate about whether to support military action and questioned whether their special relationship with Hill Knowlton, the PR firm, should prompt a congressional investigation to find out if their actions merely constituted an obvious conflict of interest, or worse, if they knew who the tearful Nayirah really was in October of 1990. And in fact, that story earned MacArthur the Monthly Journalism Award from the Washington Monthly in April 1992 and the Mencken Award in 1993. So, what's one way to win the hearts and minds of people? Well, you strut a 15-year-old girl out, bawling her eyes out and making accusations like that. Well, that certainly worked. And that wouldn't be the first time the Bush family would lie to get the U.S. involved into something that we had no business getting involved in. And we'll touch on that on our next episode. I hope you all will join us tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to listen to Red Pill Radio. We'll be talking about Jimmy Carter, Jim Baker, the voting report that they came out with years ago, and why wasn't it used this year to help prevent voter fraud. We're going to talk a little bit about the Nuremberg Code. And I found a very interesting Australian news report that came out today that's telling us to think very carefully before writing Trump off. He may have one last rabbit in the hat. Thanks for joining us today, November 23rd, 2020, for Conspiracy Theories Investigated. Don't forget, DelmarvaStudios.net tonight at 9 p.m. Chat room's open. Until next time, folks, I'm George Hobbs. We'll see ya.
Thank you so much for listening to Delmarva Studios Radio. We are now streaming 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You currently have 2 options for listening. One is by logging on to DelmarvaStudios.net and clicking on the Listen Now option. The other option is downloading the Delmarva Studios app from the Google Play Store for Android. Delmarva Studios Radio plays all of our great podcasts and the latest in independent music. If you love Delmarva Radio, we would appreciate if you would go to DelmarvaStudios.net and click on the Donate Now button. Our podcasts have already amassed over 6,000 downloads, and can be enjoyed on such platforms as iTunes, iHeartRadio, Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, and of course, our home on Spreaker.com. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Delmarva Studios. Feel free to send any questions or comments to delmarvastudios@mail.com. From all of us at Delmarva Studios, thank you for all of your support. You're listening to DelmarvaStudios.net.